Hi, Richard Dennis here, with another in my series of short biographies of notables of the early 20th century who are forgotten today. Ambulance volunteers are a large part of World War I lore, due in no small part to Ernest Hemingway's novel A Farewell to Arms. As early as 1914, long before the United States declared war on Germany and Austria in 1917, thousands of young men, many from elite American universities, traveled overseas to help out in the European War. A few of them, like Hemingway, became quite famous in later years. But in my quest to uncover forgotten notables, I'm going to talk about two men who organized and ran the volunteer ambulance corps. Richard Norton was a Harvard-educated college professor, fine arts historian, and archaeologist before the war. When the war started in August 1914, he traveled from Boston to Europe with the intention of helping in whatever way he could. In France, he quickly saw the need for transporting wounded soldiers to the medical care they desperately needed. He bought 10 automobiles and staffed them with volunteer drivers, mostly Americans. Then, working through the British Red Cross, he took them to France, where they were attached to the Second French Army. At the same time, he enlisted family and friends back in the U.S. to raise money and encourage others to volunteer. Initially, the drivers transported men to and from hospitals safely behind the front lines. But after much badgering by Norton, the volunteers were permitted to drive closer to the fighting and transport men from the field dressing stations to the field hospitals. They witnessed up close the horror of the injuries suffered by the soldiers and dodged artillery shelling and poison gas to bring those soldiers to safety. By the spring of 1917, the Corps had 240 ambulances. Norton was awarded the Croix de Guerre in 1915 and the Grand Croix of the Legion of Honor in 1917, the highest award given to any foreigner during the war. Norton had a rival, well, three of them, in fact. The first of these was H. Herman Hargis, a senior partner of the Morgan Hargis Bank in Paris. Hargis's organizations operated in a different region and was eventually merged with Norton's under the aegis of the American Red Cross, with Norton having command of field operations while Hargis took over administration in Paris. The third rival showed up in the last year of the war, and I'll get back to them later. But Norton's principal rival during the main years was A. Piat Andrew. Andrew graduated from Princeton and received a Ph.D. from Harvard, where he became an assistant professor and later a director of the U.S. Mint and assistant secretary of the Treasury. He soon became head of the American Ambulance Field Service, which operated directly under the command of the French Army with no connection to the Red Cross. Like Norton, he used his connections in the U.S. to raise money and recruit volunteers. By early 1917, his organization had over 1,200 volunteers, and like Norton, he was awarded the Croix de Guerre and the Legion of Honor. In April 1917, the U.S. entered the war. Although no American troops saw action until November that year, the Army decided to militarize the ambulance volunteers. Norton, along with his staff, refused officer commissions, and most of his volunteers declined to join the Army, where they would have been privates. Andrew accepted the commission. Although he was promoted to lieutenant colonel, and despite the expertise he had developed during the war, he was largely ignored by the Army command, which preferred regular Army soldiers as drivers. Norton contracted meningitis and died in August 1918 before he could return to America. Andrews returned home and served in Congress until his death in 1936. For more information about these two men and the men and women who drove ambulances, I recommend the book Gentlemen Volunteers, by Arlen J. Hansen. I hope you've enjoyed this brief look at two of the fascinating people who influenced the 20th century through their words and actions. In an upcoming video, I will focus on Hemingway and others who achieved fame in the years after their ambulance driving days were over. And please check out my novel, Fiume Restoral, on sale on Amazon and other fine retail sites.